Welcome to this Masterclass Explainer, where we're going to equip you with the exact toolkit of a clinical psychologist acting as an investigator. Today, we are going to teach you how to bridge that tricky gap between abstract scientific research and deeply personal individual patient care. We're diving deep into the clinical case study method, looking at exactly how professionals piece together the incredibly complex puzzle of human behavior. Let's get right into it.
Here is our syllabus for today's lesson. First, decoding the case study. Then the clinician's toolkit, the clinical investigative process, formulating the why, and finally, strengths, limits, and ethics.
Section 1. Decoding the case study, the foundations of investigation. So unlike large-scale group-based research that you might be used to, your job as a clinician in a case study is strictly idiographic. Basically, you're zooming all the way in. You're taking broad, general psychological principles and applying them to a uniquely specific human life. We're talking about looking at the intricate interplay between someone's personality, their environment, and their personal history. It's really all about achieving a holistic, complete understanding of one single, specific constellation of life events.
Now, let's clear up a common misconception right off the bat. A case study is your active, dynamic investigative method. It's literally how you generate hypotheses and bring abstract clinical material to life. A case report, on the other hand, well, that's simply the formal paperwork. It's just the static product of an evaluation that records a client's baseline functioning before you even start any intervention. So remember the takeaway here. The study is the active, breathing process, while the report is just the documentation. Moving right along to Section 2, the clinician's toolkit, gathering the clues. You know, in a world absolutely obsessed with massive data sets and algorithms, the case study often centers around a highly unusual sample size, N equals 1. Whether you're conducting a clinical study focused on psychopathology, writing a descriptive narrative account, or even doing an explanatory study looking for controlling variables, this single subject focus is the beating heart of your investigation. Now, occasionally you might look at a clinical series of individuals sequentially to test a treatment's effectiveness, but make no mistake, the spotlight remains hyper-focused on the individual. Because you're focusing on just one individual, you can never, ever rely on just one single clue. And that's exactly where triangulation comes into play. To form a coherent, solid clinical picture, you've got to cross-verify your findings by combining multiple, diverse sources of data. If a client tells you something, you don't just take it at face value. You go looking for environmental or historical evidence to back it up. Your 4 primary sources of clues range from the highly subjective to the strictly objective. First up, clinical interviews. These give you vital self-report data. It's where you learn about the client's internal world, their thoughts, their feelings, their history. Second, direct observation. This gives you a live, real-time sample of how the person actually interacts with their environment, which, interestingly enough, can often contradict or add a lot of nuance to their self-reports. Third, psychological tests. Standardized tools like the MMPI-2 or Waze IV-4 give you hard, quantifiable data to test your hypotheses against. And finally, life records. Things like medical or school archives corroborate those subjective self-reports with hard historical facts. It's like building an airtight legal case by layering different types of evidence. Section 3. The clinical investigative process, step by step. Your iterative decision-making process as a clinician is actually highly structured. You start by selecting a case. Maybe it illustrates a super rare disorder or a brand new treatment. Then you systematically sift through data, conducting assessments and gathering collateral information from family or peers. Next, you formulate your hypotheses, linking underlying psychosocial factors to the current condition. Once you've got that understanding down, you apply diagnostic rules, like the ones in the DSM-5, before establishing short and long-term goals in your treatment plan. Finally, you implement the intervention itself, monitor the progress session by session, and conduct a long-term follow-up to make sure those benefits actually stick. It's a continuous, rigorous loop of testing, refining, and testing again. All right, Section 4. Formulating the why, the biopsychosocial model. To easily remember how to structure your hypotheses as a clinician, just use this classic mnemonic, the 4 Ps. First, predisposing factors. These are long-standing vulnerabilities like negative schemas. Think of a deeply held childhood belief like, I'm a failure. Second, precipitating factors. These are the acute life stressors, say, a sudden job loss, that actually trigger the current episode. Third, perpetuating factors. These are the environmental contingencies or avoidance behaviors that lock the distress into place and keep it going.
And fourth, protective factors. These are the person's inherent strengths, their social supports, or cultural pride that facilitate resilience. Mastering these 4 specific elements, that is literally the key to cracking the case. Crucially, to avoid just imposing your own worldview onto the client's life, you've got to engage in collaborative conceptualization. This is a culturally responsive approach where you and the client jointly define the problem. You aren't just some lone detective working in an isolated vacuum. No, you're actively partnering with the client to make absolutely sure the formulation accurately reflects their actual lived reality and background. Section 5. Strengths, Limits, and Ethics. The Debrief. This whole method isn't just versatile, it's often our absolute only window into studying conditions with base rates so incredibly low that finding a large sample size is, well, mathematically impossible. It serves as the essential initial testing ground for brand new treatment innovations and acts as the primary tool in scientist-practitioner training. Beyond all that, it has massive heuristic value. What that means is it efficiently draws the attention of the wider professional community to emerging trends, like sudden unexplained gains in therapy that simply haven't been studied in a lab environment yet. But of course, these massive advantages come with real, tangible limitations that we have to critically evaluate. The profound advantage here is that detailed, idiographic understanding that broadband tests completely miss, giving you real-world applicability to perfectly tailored treatments. However, findings from one specific individual fundamentally lack generalization to the broader population. On top of that, clinicians risk confirmatory bias, inadvertently seeing only the data that supports their initial hunch. And we constantly struggle with threats to internal validity, things like natural maturation as the client simply grows older, or historical effects from external life events that we just cannot control. Now, here is a pretty humbling fact for any clinical detective. Despite all this deep, nuanced investigative work, a clinician's subjective judgment consistently falls short of pure actuarial or statistical prediction. It's a really stark, scientific reminder that while holistic understanding is incredibly valuable for tailoring human treatment, our inherent human subjectivity always carries a wider margin of error when it comes to pure prediction. Therefore, to maintain absolute integrity and validity in this field, you are bound by strict ethical rules. You must obtain informed consent upfront and clearly explain the limits of confidentiality, such as mandatory reporting for risks of child abuse or self-harm. Crucially, when you're actually publishing these case studies, the protection of identity is paramount. You must use clinical composites. This means changing names, altering demographics, and blending details to fiercely conceal your client's identity. And ethically, you owe it to your client to provide detailed feedback on your final formulation to verify its accuracy and actively empower them in their own recovery journey. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final dilemma to chew on. The case study method gives us unparalleled insight into the unique human condition, but it lacks the broad statistical power of large-scale research. So, as clinical detectives, how do we balance the deeply human, holistic elements of our clients with the cold, rigid demands of scientific validity? It's a fundamental question you've got to answer each and every time you open a new case file.